So we saw in the last screencast how data flows throughout a Redux application. We saw how to make a store, how to pass in a function to create store. We call that a reducer. And we saw that our reducer is where we define our initial state and where we can make changes to our state by returning a copy of the state. How did we make changes to the state? Remember that we dispatched an action. Dispatch is really just the idea of sending some kind of action. The store is in charge of dispatching these actions, and actions are simply objects that have to contain a key of type. So we saw how to do this in the Chrome DevTools. We're going to take that example of a counter and just build a very simple application with a little bit of jQuery to show how that works. So I'll make a directory and I'll call that redux counter. And inside of here, I'll make two files. I'll make an index.html and we'll just make a script.js. We'll keep it real simple. And I'll open this all up in Sublime. So in Sublime right now, I have an index.html, and I'm just going to start with a very, very simple h1 with an ID of counter. And we're not really going to have anything here. We're going to set the text depending on whatever our count is. And Redux is actually going to store our count. So we'll make a button. We'll give this an ID of increment, and we'll have the text increment. And then we'll do the same thing for a button of decrement. So that's going to be decrement. Now we're not going to get very far without jQuery and Redux. So let's go back and grab a jQuery CDN. We'll go over here and we'll get the uncompressed version. So if there are any errors, we should be in good shape. Let's go copy that. We'll also grab the Redux CDN. So let's go grab this right here. Make sure that we have a script tag and we can add src of that right there. And that looks good. We're also going to need a script, if I can spell that, to our script.js. Script.js. That looks good. So we should have a script for jQuery, a script for Redux, and a script for our script.js. So if I open this page right now in the browser, I should just see increment and decrement, but nothing really happens when I click these buttons. And that's for good reason, because I don't have any event listeners or anything happening. So I'm going to start in my script.js with a couple of things. We need some Redux store. But before, remember, we need a reducer. We can call that whatever we want, but let's call it root reducer. We need some Redux store and initial state. And then we need some way of changing the state. So let's start with a reducer. Remember, reducers are just functions. And that function we can call root reducer. And it accepts some kind of state and some action that's coming in. But remember, the first time that this reducer is run, we need to set some kind of initial state. So once again, we could do something like if state is undefined, then we can do something by setting the state, but let's keep it real simple using default parameters. We'll make a variable. In fact, we can make this a constant. We'll call that initial state. And this is going to be an object with a key of count and a value of 0. And inside of here, we're simply going to say if there is no state, we'll pass in initial state. And remember, there is no state passed to this the first time that that root reducer is run. When's the first time that the root reducer is run? When we run redux.createStore. Remember that dispatch comes in with an action with a type of redux init. If you don't remember seeing that, take a look at the previous screencast and I'll show you again even in this one. So inside of createStore, we're going to pass in our root reducer, but remember for now we always just want to return some kind of state. And what we're going to do just to keep it simple is set a debugger right here and make sure that we're getting to our root reducer. So I'm going to go open this up in the browser and let's go keep our DevTools open. And when we refresh the page, we should see that we've made it to the root reducer. Remember, the first time that you call createStore, which should really only be once, we're going to dispatch an action with a type of redux init. This is all done internally by Redux to figure out what your state starts off as. So we can see right here, when we call store.getState, we should have count of 0. Let's say you forgot for some reason to pass in some kind of initial state right here. When we go refresh the page in our debugger, we should see that state is undefined. So our initial state right now is actually undefined, and we don't want that. We want to make sure that we start off with some kind of initial state. So always make sure you set that default parameter right here. So we're going to need some way to increment and decrement, but why don't we start with a little bit of jQuery? I'm going to start with a quick document.ready, and we'll add some event listeners. We'll say when an ID of increment is clicked, we are going to run some kind of function. And here, what do we need to do? We need to dispatch some action to increment the count. And we could actually do the same thing with decrement. Decrement on click, we need to dispatch some action to decrement the count. Now, where do these actions get created? Well, remember, actions are just objects. So what we could do here is simply call store.dispatch and pass in an object. Remember, our actions, which are the objects, always have to have a key of type. So let's give it a type of increment. And we could call this whatever we'd like. But remember that when we dispatch this action, it's going to go back to the reducer. So why don't we, for now, just put a debugger right here? Before I load the page, think how many times we're going to hit that debugger once. Before I load the page, remember, this debugger is going to be reached the first time that we call create store. So we set some initial state. And whenever I click this increment button, we're going to go right back here. So let's save this. Let's go back to the browser and refresh the page. The first time that I go back here, I get an action with a type of redux init. That's just Redux setting up some initial state. What happens when I click increment again, I go back here, but the action now has a type of increment. Great. So what do we do with this new action with a type of increment? Well, let's write a little bit of conditional logic. We could do something like if action.type, and this is what we did in the last screencast, but what I want to introduce is a more common way you'll see of handling different action types. And what we're actually going to do is use a case switch statement. So we are going to switch on the action.type. And what we're going to do here is say, in the case of increment, we are going to set a debugger right now and return the state. Now remember, with all of your case switch statements, you always have some kind of default, which is what's going to happen when there's nothing there. So in this default action, I'm going to return that state. Let's go save this. So let's go back to the browser and refresh the page. When I increment, I'm back here inside of this switch statement. So all we've done is, instead of using if-else's, we've used a case switch statement. You probably haven't done case switch statements in a while, so feel free to take a look back at MDN to see how this is all happening. We're moving pretty quickly, so let's take a step back and talk about what we've done so far. We've set up a simple h1 with an ID of counter. It doesn't have any value right now because this is where we're actually going to increment and decrement those values. We've loaded a little bit of jQuery and some Redux so that we can use jQuery for DOM manipulation and Redux for managing our state. We're not going to make some global variable for the count because imagine that that variable or data needed to be shared amongst different files. It'd be really nice if we had one centralized place to store that information, and that's exactly what Redux lets us do. Finally, I'm just loading a script called script.js, which I have right here. Before I worry about any of the DOM manipulation or waiting for the DOM to load, I set up some initial state. Remember, initial state could be an object, it could be an array. Most of the time, you'll see it as an object. And here I have a property of count and a value of 0. In order for our store to be created, we always have to pass a function to it. We call that function a reducer. In this case, we only have one reducer, so we'll call it the root reducer. This accepts some kind of state and some kind of action. Actions are simply objects that get dispatched or sent by the store to make changes or to see what the state is. The first time that I call create store, Redux dispatches an action with the type of redux init. And this is simply just to get our default state. But in the future, if I want to dispatch different actions, I just call store.dispatch. And remember, actions are just objects and they always have to have the key of type. Because in the reducer, I'm going to figure out what the type is. And if it's increment, I'm going to do something here. So what should we do if it's increment? Why don't we just do state.count++ and return the state? In fact, let's get fancy. Let's go say case decrement. All we need to do here, state.count --. So we're just going to increment that count or decrement that count. Now, when I dispatch the type of increment, that works out really well, but I actually have to change the value of that h1. So what I'd like to do is, after I dispatch that value of increment, I would like to figure out what the state looks like, specifically to count, and set that to be the text of my h1. How do we figure out what the state is of the store? Well, we have that wonderful way using store.getState. This is a built-in method to our store. So I'm going to get the state, which should be changed after I dispatch this action. And I'm going to set on my h1, which I believe I gave an ID of counter, I'm going to set the text to be current state.count. I'll do the same thing here actually. inside of decrement. But instead of dispatching a type of increment, I'm going to dispatch a type of decrement. When decrement is clicked, dispatch decrement. It's going to go to the reducer, take 1 away from the state, the count property specifically, and return that state. And then I'm going to set the text of the counter to be whatever the current state is. Let's go try this out. I'm going to refresh the page. I'm going to increment, and it looks like it's working. Well, that's pretty cool. If we want it to be a little bit fancier, we could do something like when the DOM loads, get the current state, and once again, set the text of that counter to be the current state. Now there's a lot of repetition here, and we could refactor this with some helper functions, but I'm just going to keep it simple for now. So when I refresh the page, I see 0. If we take a look right now at store.getState, it's 0. How about when I increment? That looks good. When I decrement, that looks good. But there's still something that's not great about what I've done. Remember that our reducers have to be pure functions. And what that means is that we cannot modify state directly. We should always make a copy of our state. So we'll make a variable called newState, and we'll set that to be whatever the state was before. Now, another way that we could do this is by using object.assign. Just remember, with object.assign, your first parameter should always be an empty object. That way we don't overwrite the object instead of making a copy of it. Remember, the first parameter should always be an empty object to object.assign. So I can make a copy of that state using this right here, or I could do what I have above. Here I can say newState.count++, and then I can return the new state. Let's do this as well with our decrement, but instead we're simply going to subtract those values. I'll save this, and let's go refresh the page and see what it looks like. Ooh, new state has already been declared. Let's see what I did wrong here. Looks like I used the let keyword more than one time inside of my switch statement. So instead of let, let's just use var. We'll keep it real simple right now. Let's try to increment, and decrement isn't working. How come decrement's not working? Well, let's make sure we dispatch that type of decrement. So let's go make sure that we're actually hitting this in the debugger. So we'll go set a debugger right here. Let's go refresh the page, and we're in the debugger. But what's the problem right now? We're returning state. Silly me. Let's make sure we return new state. Let's go save this, refresh the page. Increment is great, and decrement seems to be working. So sometimes you make some silly mistakes. Just make sure to set a debugger. Really help you out. So it looks like increment and decrement are working, and we're simply making a new copy of the state each time. You could do this above if you'd like, but I want to be really verbose here. So it seems like what we've got is a simple working counter where we can increment and decrement, and we're using a pure function in our root reducer. So let's take one more step back and walk through everything that we've done. In our index.html, we have a simple counter. We have a button to increment and a button to decrement. We have our scripts for jQuery, Redux, and our external script, script.js. The first thing we do is declare some initial state. In this application, we're just using a count and going to start it at 0. We then have a root reducer, and we saw that this accepts some kind of state and some action that is being dispatched. The first time that an action is dispatched is when create store runs, and that's where the redux init action comes in. Remember, that's just for the purpose of creating an initial state. So what we do is, in the event that there is not a state yet, let's just use this initial state and return that. In the future, we're going to see what the action type is, and if it's increment or decrement, we'll make a new copy of the state, and in this case we'll increment. In decrement, we'll make a new copy of the state and decrement as well. We then make our Redux store, and that's pretty much the bulk of the Redux work that we do. When the DOM loads, we see whatever the state of the store is. This should be an object with count of 0. We then set the text of the h1 to be 0. That way we can just start with whatever the current state is. Now it's nicer to do this than to hard code the number 0 right here, because imagine that maybe we're using a database to persist things. We don't want to hard code some kind of number. What if last time we left off, our counter was at 2 or -5? Anytime that we click on the button with an ID of increment, we're going to dispatch an action. Remember, all of our actions always have to have a key of type. What we're then going to do is see what the state is at that point. Imagine this is the first time. It might look like this. So we'll set the h1 text to be 1. Let's imagine that we go and decrement or click on the decrement button. We're going to dispatch once again an action with a type of decrement. Remember, anytime we dispatch an action, we always go back to the reducer and run this code. Since our action.type is decrement, we should reach this code right here, which makes a copy of the state, subtracts 1 from whatever the count is of that copy, and returns it. We then grab whatever is in the state. Let's imagine at this point that would look like count back at 0, and then we set the h1 text to be 0. So this would be just an idea of loading it, incrementing, and decrementing. Let's see that one more time in the browser, or I'll refresh the page. That would be incrementing and decrementing. We can always take a look at our get state because we've put that store in the global scope. So you can always see what your store can do. We're really just going to use dispatch and get state at this point. We'll keep it real simple. Feel free to take a look at some of this code. Take your time walking through it and try to practice and build this on your own. Just remember, reducers are pure functions, stores are created using those functions, which we call reducers, and stores dispatch actions, which are simply objects that always have to contain the key of type. And when an action is dispatched, we go back to that reducer and change the state by making a copy of it and then returning that copy. That way we can always have a pure function. So try this out again, and I'll see you in the next video.